The candle flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows across the cold stone walls. A soft whimper echoed down the corridor, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The scent of mold and burning tallow filled the air, thick and choking. Somewhere a bell tolled, but it was not for prayer. It was a signal, a warning, a mark of fear. A young girl, barely 10, knelt on the floor, hands raw and bruised, as a stern nun's voice cut through the darkness. "You will not speak of this, ever." Her tears fell silently, landing on the cold tiles, but no one came to comfort her. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, closing in with every heartbeat. How could something so horrific have been considered normal? Before we go deeper into this darkness, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. But this nightmare began long before the candles flickered and the stone halls echoed with fear. In the heart of medieval Europe, convents were meant to be sanctuaries of piety and devotion. Girls, some no older than 7, were sent from their homes, often under promises of education, safety, and spiritual guidance. But behind the thick walls and iron gates, a different reality awaited them, one of rigid discipline, cruel rituals, and punishments that blurred the line between faith and terror. No one spoke of the harshness within these walls. Visitors saw serene courtyards and disciplined nuns, unaware of the muffled cries hidden behind heavy doors. Families believed their daughters were being prepared for virtuous lives, yet the very institutions meant to protect them had become cages. Sound, distant drums. Visual, burning skyline. The convents operated under strict hierarchies. The abbess held absolute power, her word unquestionable, her judgment final. Below her, a network of nuns acted as enforcers, wielding both spiritual authority and physical punishment with terrifying efficiency. Children were trained to obey without question, punished for the smallest acts of defiance, often in ways designed to instill both fear and guilt. But no one knew what was coming. The rules were more than rules. They were traps. Girls learned to hide, to whisper, to exist in the shadows, knowing that a single misstep could result in severe physical or emotional torment. Punishments ranged from prolonged isolation to starvation, from public shaming to forced confessions of sins they had not committed. The convent's curriculum on the surface promised literacy, religious instruction, and practical skills. Beneath this facade, children were drilled to suppress curiosity and desire, to internalize the notion that any natural feeling was sinful. Their bodies became battlegrounds, their minds theaters of fear. Sound, echoing chant. Visual, darkened hallways with swinging lamps. Families were complicit, often blinded by the authority of the church or terrified of challenging the system. Letters sent home were censored, complaints ignored. The girls' voices were lost in the walls, their suffering invisible to the outside world. Only the occasional scandal reached the public, and even then it was dismissed as rumor, exaggeration, or moral failing of the child herself. But no one knew what was coming. Within this rigid, sacred structure, seeds of obsession, cruelty, and paranoia were being sown, seeds that would later bloom into horrifying realities the church could never admit. Children who entered with innocence left with trauma etched into every sinew of their being. The air inside the convent was thick with incense and fear. Steps echoed like drums of judgment, whispered prayers were laced with terror. Nuns moved silently, their eyes sharp, always watching. A slip of the tongue, a misstep in the dormitory, a glance too long at a forbidden book, all could trigger a punishment that left marks, visible and invisible, for years to come. And yet the outside world remained unaware. The convent was cloaked in sanctity, its horrors hidden beneath the veneer of devotion. Even the church's own records, meticulously kept, often obscured abuses, framing discipline as moral necessity. The girls, meanwhile, grew accustomed to suffering, learning to mask tears with smiles, confusion with obedience, fear with piety. These walls had seen it all, centuries of whispered confessions, midnight terrors, and broken spirits. But the question remained, how could such suffering persist under the guise of sanctity? What terrible force allowed these horrors to continue, unnoticed and unchallenged? Engagement. Prompt. Could you imagine sending a child into a place like this? Comment below with what you would have done to protect them. No one knew what was coming. The first spark of obsession, cruelty, and control had already taken root, and it would grow in ways that no one, not even the most pious observer, could have anticipated. And as the girls adjusted to the oppressive rhythm of convent life, a darker force began to stir. The abbess, once seen as a stern but fair authority, grew increasingly obsessive over control, her devotion twisted into tyranny. Every rule became a tool, every ritual a method of instilling fear. What began as discipline slowly morphed into obsession, and the girls were caught in a web they could neither understand nor escape. Small signs appeared first, a whispered threat in the chapel, a sudden, unexplained punishment. One girl, punished for failing to kneel perfectly, found herself isolated in a dark chamber, the walls whispering echoes of her own screams. The nuns watched from shadows, eyes glinting with satisfaction, sound, wind howling through the stone. Visual, candle flames flickering in the drafty corridor. The abbess's ambitions were subtle at first, cloaked in religious devotion. He preached purity, obedience, and spiritual perfection, yet the measures she enforced grew more extreme. Meals were restricted, confessions prolonged into hours of mental torment, and minor mistakes were met with humiliations that scarred both body and soul. But what she did next shocked even her allies. The abbess began selecting certain girls for special attention under the guise of spiritual training. The selected children were isolated, their days filled with unnatural rituals and exercises designed to break their will. By the time they were allowed to return to the dormitory, they were changed, silent, fearful, and obedient beyond reason. Rumors spread among the children like a creeping disease. Girls whispered in corners about secret punishments, about the abbess's growing obsession with control, and about the chilling rewards promised for perfect obedience. Some tried to resist, others, too afraid, conformed, and in this mixture of fear and compliance, the convent itself seemed alive, its halls breathing with the tension of suppressed terror. Sound, distant chanting, visual, flickering shadows on the stone walls. No one could foresee what was coming. Even the nuns who assisted the abbess began to feel unease, noticing that their own actions were becoming harsher than necessary, their consciences numbed by repeated cruelty. Yet they could not, or would not, challenge her. As the abbess's obsession intensified, the children became unwilling actors in her dark performances. Lessons in piety were replaced with drills in silence and submission. Failures were punished not only physically but spiritually, instilling guilt so deep it became impossible for the girls to imagine escape. Engagement. Prompt. If you were in this situation, could you have resisted? Comment below with your thoughts. A forbidden curiosity began to surface. Some girls began to quietly observe, to memorize routines, to understand the hidden patterns of punishment. But the abbess noticed. Those who dared to watch too closely faced her wrath in ways that no child could anticipate. The tension built slowly like a tightening noose. The once orderly and quiet convent was now a ticking trap, every corner hiding surveillance, every whisper potentially deadly. And yet amidst the fear, the abbess's obsession only grew, her control tightening like a vice around the innocent hearts of the children. What drove her? Was it pure devotion gone mad, a hunger for power, or something even darker? The answer would reveal itself, but not before the first true fracture. The snap that would shatter the fragile order arrived. Then everything snapped. It started as a simple mistake, or at least, it seemed simple. A girl had whispered to another, a brief exchange almost imperceptible. But the abbess caught it. Her eyes burned with a fury no one had ever seen. The halls that had been tense with silent fear now vibrated with impending violence. Steps pounded against stone floors. Doors slammed. The air seemed to constrict around the children, making it hard to breathe. Sound, heartbeat. Visual, trembling hands clutching cold stone walls. Punishment was swift and merciless. The girl was dragged into the shadowed corridor, the other children forced to watch. The abbess's voice cut through the screams like a blade. Disobedience is a sin against God and against me. Every syllable carried the weight of doom. The girl's pleas were ignored, her cries echoing back at her, swallowed by the stone. But it wasn't just the punishment that shocked everyone. It was the intensity, the sheer precision with which the abbess orchestrated fear. She began targeting others, testing limits, pushing boundaries. Obedience became a game of survival. Each child was forced into impossible tasks, trivial errors punished as if they were crimes of blasphemy. Sound, echoing footsteps, visual, shadows stretching across stone walls. The turning point wasn't just punishment, it was betrayal. Nuns, who had once guided these children, now became enforcers of terror, their loyalty to the abbess surpassing their compassion. One by one, children were isolated, tormented, and reshaped into vessels of compliance. Whispered cries became routine, suffering became ritual. The convent's very walls seemed to pulse with the collective terror, feeding the abbess's obsession. And yet, in the shadows, small sparks of defiance began to flicker. Some girls refused to completely bend, their eyes watching, memorizing, waiting. But the cost of resistance was immediate and brutal. No one knew how far this cruelty would stretch. The abbess's snap had released forces that could not be contained. The convent had transformed from a house of devotion into a prison of fear. Each corridor, each dormitory, each chapel held secrets that were unspeakable, horrors too vivid to forget. Engagement. Prompt: could you survive in a place like this? Comment with what you think you would do. And as night fell, the convent seemed to exhale, a dark breath that carried whispers of torment. The children huddled together in silence, knowing that the snap had changed everything. Nothing would ever be the same again. The question lingered in the air, heavy as the stone above them. How far would the abbess go, and who would be left standing when the terror finally reached its peak? And the aftermath was darker than anyone imagined. The convent that had once hummed with whispered prayers and ritualized devotion now reeked of despair. Children moved like shadows, their eyes hollow, their hands trembling. Bruises and scars marked their small bodies, but the true injuries were invisible. The fear etched into their minds, the trauma that clung to every thought. Sound, distant wailing. Visual, flickering candlelight reflecting on tear-streaked faces. Those who had survived the abyss's snap found themselves forever changed. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of a door, every flicker of candlelight, reminded them of the horrors they endured. Trust was a foreign concept. Laughter, once natural, was now a weapon against sanity. They were living reminders of cruelty disguised as devotion, innocence consumed by obsession. The abbess herself seemed to revel in the aftermath, her authority absolute, her obsession unchecked. Children were broken into perfect obedience, but the cost was visible in the hollow eyes of the survivors. There was no joy, only compliance and terror. And yet, whispers of revolt began to surface among those few who had retained a shred of defiance. Sound, echoing footsteps. Visual, shadows crawling along damp stone walls. Families who eventually learned of the horrors were horrified, but the church shielded its reputation. Records were altered, complaints dismissed, and survivors often blamed for their own suffering. The world outside remained largely unaware, as if the convent's walls had swallowed all evidence of human cruelty. The children's daily lives became a cycle of ritualized torment. Meals were meager, confessions were long and psychologically draining, and punishments ranged from the physical to the deeply humiliating. Each day blurred into the next, an endless spiral of fear. Friends were torn apart by forced accusations. Siblings in spirit became enemies under the abbess's manipulations. Sound, chanting echoing in the distance. Visual, a girl trembling in a dark corridor. Even nuns who had initially resisted became instruments of terror. Their morality corroded by obedience, they enforced the abbess's every cruel whim. The children learned that resistance brought not justice but worse punishment. Every lesson in faith carried with it an undercurrent of dread, every smile a mask, hiding desperation. And yet, amidst the horror, human resilience flickered. Some girls secretly comforted one another, whispered encouragements in the dead of night, shared morsels of food or tiny gestures of hope. But these moments were fleeting, quickly crushed by the oppressive machinery of fear that surrounded them. Sound, muffled sobs. Visual, cold, empty dormitories. The story of suffering and cruelty spread slowly, taking decades to emerge fully in historical records. Scholars later pieced together the fragments, testimonies of broken girls, the accounts of concerned outsiders, the small admissions of remorse from aging nuns who had lived through the nightmare. Engagement. Prompt. Could you imagine being trapped in a place where no one could hear your cries? Share your thoughts below. In the end, the convent stood as a monument not to faith but to human cruelty disguised as devotion, and the children who endured were left to carry the invisible scars of trauma, a legacy of horror that would haunt them long after the stone walls crumbled and the candles went out. The true cost of obedience and fear was measured not in bruises or broken bones, but in the silence that followed, the quiet, haunted lives of those who survived. Years passed, but the shadows of the convent lingered. The children who had survived carried their scars into adulthood, their innocence lost forever. Some found solace in quiet lives, others in rebellion, but all bore the imprint of trauma, a reminder that even sacred walls could shelter unspeakable cruelty. The world outside had largely forgotten them, but the echoes of suffering refused to fade. The convent itself continued, cloaked in the guise of sanctity, yet cracks in its foundation began to appear. Moral collapse was subtle but inevitable. The power wielded unchecked had consequences that rippled far beyond the stone walls. Generations of nuns and children alike would feel the aftershocks of obsession, fear, and control, as whispered tales became lessons of warning for those who followed. Sound, wind rattling through empty windows. Visual, long-abandoned corridors bathed in pale moonlight. Society began to confront its blind faith in institutions. Questions once unthinkable about authority, morality, and protection of the vulnerable started to surface. Survivors' testimonies slowly emerged, revealing the dark truths that had been buried for centuries. Scholars and historians pieced together fragments of horror, exposing a reality that had once been hidden behind sacred facades. Sound, distant church bells. Visual, aged manuscripts and faded illustrations. But the deepest legacy was human. The children who had endured learned resilience in the face of unspeakable suffering. They became silent witnesses, their memories haunting each decision, each interaction, each thought. The convent's horrors shaped not only individuals but the cultural memory of communities, a reminder of what can happen when power goes unchecked. And yet there was a final revelation. The abbess's obsession, chronicled in hidden records, finally explained the depth of her cruelty. The perfection she sought was never spiritual but a twisted pursuit of control. Those who suffered had unknowingly become instruments in a grotesque experiment of domination and fear. The question first raised in the cold corridors, the driving force behind the terror, was answered at last. Engagement. Prompt. What do you think is the most important lesson from this story? Comment your thoughts below. And today, the echoes of medieval convent horrors remind us to question authority, protect the innocent, and recognize the quiet suffering that can exist behind closed doors. The story of those children is more than history. It is a mirror, reflecting the darkness that can flourish when fear and devotion intertwine. Sound, whispering winds through empty halls. Visual, candles burning out one by one. In the end, the convent may have crumbled, its stone walls reduced to rubble, but the legacy of suffering and resilience remains, a haunting reminder that darkness often wears the guise of sanctity, and innocence can be consumed by obsession. The horrors of the medieval convent did not end with stone and mortar. They lived on in the hearts of the children, in the whispered stories passed through generations, and in the silent warnings etched into history. What was considered normal for those innocent girls was anything but normal, an enduring testament to human cruelty disguised as devotion. As we reflect on these chilling events, we are reminded of the fragile boundary between faith and fanaticism, obedience and oppression. The convent may have stood as a house of sanctity, but it became a chamber of suffering, a place where innocence was systematically stripped away. If this darkness shocked you, share this story, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments what haunted you most. Even centuries later, the echo of tiny footsteps in shadowed halls lingers, a haunting reminder that where devotion ends and obsession begins, horror quietly waits.